Welcome to Intune training. Today we'll be taking a look at authentication methods with Ben. Take it away.
It's me. Hey,
Ben,
what's up?
I think it says the intern down there. Ooh, the other way.
Yeah.
Oh, it says the intern. Oh, sorry.
That guy.
It was part of my it was part of my renewal, my contract renewal, that every now and again I'd be given a name as well as my job title, just because I was getting a little despondent. But yes, I am Ben the intern, and we're going to talk about very exciting stuff, authentication.
Ben
now,
the intern. How long?
It's infinite. It doesn't stop.
Indefinite.
You know, they always say that, you know, if you think you've learned everything, then you haven't learned anything at all. So like, there's always room to grow and expand. So I feel like, you know, intern for life.
Infinite.
Yeah, unpaid intern. Unfortunately, I want to see if I can figure out how to get away from the unpaid stuff. But
we'll give you some 5 gum or something like that. But
oh, nice.
I had to pay to be the special extended guest. I mean, what's this unpaid stuff?
Sean,
we don't talk about that out loud.
Yeah.
Okay, so I haven't been on the graph series in a while. So obviously I've been brought on so that we can start doing a little sort of deep divey stuff into what we're doing. But I guess before we get into the code, what have you guys done so far, and sort of why am I here?
well, I guess I should apologize first because I switched to your screen, but we'll switch back to the video here. But realistically, we've really only done like device-based authentication, at least for testing and like getting used to like how to use Graph. We've done a little bit with the Graph Explorer, but beyond that, we haven't done a whole lot. We want to do some stuff with some Azure Functions later on, but for now, the basics.
So we've also talked about where to go to find the information you need. And so in full disclosure, we figured we would all do what we always do, and that's just go to you. So
right.
Sure. Okay.
You want to write a script? Just message Ben. He'll write it for you.
Just message Ben. Yeah, exactly. I do it for free as well. And I never say no. All right. So I guess the easiest way to start with this stuff is feel free to share my screen, Jake.
Swapped. You're good.
Swap. Sweet. Okay, cool. So as far as authentication goes, for what we need to talk about today, it's actually kind of simple. There's two different ways to authenticate. The first one is the one that the guys have already spoken about, which is device-based authentication, which is essentially like a system account or a service account that has an app ID and a client secret, and you just authenticate. And it doesn't implicitly say, oh, you are Ben the intern. It just says, oh, you are system account. I'm going to do work. That is a really great way to do system or sort of headless tasks. So things that potentially can run in the background without you interactively monitoring or triggering those bits of code, because it implicitly doesn't need your credentials. But then the other way, which is potentially what most people start with learning, is authenticating to Graph as the person, you know, in front of the keyboard. So what we'll do today is we'll go through and show the difference between user-based authentication and device-based authentication. And then for extra credit, because we love that here, we will show you how you can do some really more modern ways of device authentication that doesn't actually involve any secrets or any credentials, but it's more secure. So I guess the first thing that I want to show is my app registration that Jake created for me. Thank you. I am a wiggle. I actually might get sued if I say that, so I won't. Okay, so specifically, I want to look at what's configured here. So I'm going to go into the API permissions. I think this is the same. You've used the same app registration for everything so far, yeah?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So for anyone who's been watching, you should understand what we're looking at here. The important thing that I want to point out here is the difference between delegate and application. Have you guys spoken a bit about this?
Very briefly. I mean, if you want to go do an extra rundown, by all means.
Sure. There's not much to it. Essentially, delegate permissions are the things that you will get when you authenticate interactively or as yourself, whereas application permissions are things that the device will get if you authenticate as a device or as a non-user. We could dive in significantly around the difference between these, but just for now, just understand that delegate means you will get that permission when you sign in. Application means that the device or the system account will get that permission. And I'll show you sort of the proof of that, I guess, when we sort of get into this. So we've already got the permission, the API permissions configured. We've got everything set up. It should be correct. I guess we'll find out. So we've got our application ID, and then normally what Jake and the guys have done previously is they generate a client secret, which we can see, and then they use that as their secret password. That's generally fine as long as you've got really good control over storing secrets and things like that. But today, because we're going to do interactive authentication, we don't need this because we're going to supply the credentials. So let me drop over to my...
Well, Ben, I will say we did that at the very first, but we did switch over to device-based pretty quickly.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I mean, it basically comes down to you need to ask yourself, whatever you're writing, so whatever automation tool that you are creating, you need to ask, how is this going to be used? Is it going to be part of like your tool belt that you physically use? So when you're doing your business as usual work, are you going to be interactively typing that command in, authenticating and running the code? Or are you going to have it just as an automation thing that runs in the background and cleans things up? Depending on what the answer to that question that you ask yourself is, depends on how you're going to authenticate. Most of the time, just little ad hoc tools can absolutely be done as the user. But most of the time, things we end up writing, especially in PowerShell, we start realizing that, hey, maybe I don't need to be present while this runs. And that's where you change the authentication over. There's other things that you need to think about. If your organization has really aggressive identity management or PIM or things like that, and you need to elevate to do that work, depending on whether you get permission or not, sometimes it makes sense to just do this as device-based authentication because it might already have those permissions so that you don't need to elevate yourself every time you need to do the work. So there's lots of questions that you need to ask yourself around this, but this is going to be hopefully a quick and dirty example of how to do this stuff. So I'm sure that you guys have spoken about the MSAL PowerShell module. That's what I'm going to be using today to do the authentication because it's absolutely fantastic. If you haven't played around with it, it's very easy to install on your computer. It's just install module msal.ps. That's going to install it into your environment, and then it just makes it very, very simple to authenticate. You don't need to overthink anything. You honestly don't even really need to know what it's doing. We've just got a couple of things in here to do our user authentication. We've got what is our tenant. This can be the tenant ID or the vanity domain that you've got. Doesn't matter. The client ID is the application registration that we've created. If I go over here, that is in just here. I can probably make that bigger. So this is the application client ID. And then what we're going to do today is we're going to do device code, which there's a reason for that. But essentially, because the app registration has been created without a correct return address, it fails in PowerShell 7. And we should all be using PowerShell 7 because it's 2023. So this is just a way to get around an incorrectly configured app registration. Jake. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to run this now. I'm going to put this in memory, and then I'm going to run this this authentication. We can see down on the bottom here, it's saying to sign in, use a web browser to open this page and put in this code. So I'm just going to do that now. It's going to bring this up for me.
What about our poor ISC users at home, Ben? You saying?
I'm saying if you're using ISC in 2023 and you have a real reason, you don't, and you should be using Windows Terminal, you should be using PowerShell 7, and you should be editing your code with VS Code. All right, so I've already signed in, so it knows who I am and what I'm trying to do. I've put in that token, so it implicitly knows that it's my PowerShell session that's trying to authenticate. But you can actually do all sorts of cool stuff around detecting whether you should be allowed to do these things or not. But for now, I'm just going to say, yes, it's me. I'm signing in. I'll click on this. Are you trying to sign into Ben as a Wiggle? So this is, again, just another confirmation that it knows that we're authenticating to that specific app. We hit continue. It says, cool, happy days. If we pop back to this, we should catch it just in time. Okay, so that's authenticated. If we have a look at the user auth token, user auth token, we can see all the information that we need around that token. So this is, we've got the access token, which is kind of the important thing. We've got the extended lifetime, unique ID, when it expires on. the ID token, which is more just information around who I am. And then we've also got the scopes. Now, this is important because this is what differentiates an app register or a user-based authentication versus a device-based authentication. And we can confirm that this data is all just being extrapolated from the access token. If we grab that access token, we're going to get really nerdy with this. I'm not going to apologize. User auth token dot access token clip. I'm going to pop over to some web tokens here. I'm just going to dump this in here. And we can see we get basically the same information that we did just before when I looked at it in PowerShell. So we can see, the app display name, the app ID. We can see who I am. So, wow, I actually have a surname as well. It's pretty impressive. Where the request came from, just basically, proof of who I am, because this is the access token, right? We need identity, and we also need the authorization. So in here, here's the scope. So when we signed in to this application, if I go API permissions here, just make this a little smaller, all of these delegated permissions, so device read write, etc., or wherever it is, device management read write, all these delegated permissions were allocated to me because they are implicitly allowed in this application. So go in here, we can see we've got device management apps, read write, manage devices, etc., but we have none of the application ones. So this is how we authenticate, and then we can do things in Graph interactively. Then make your Graph calls, do whatever you need to do. You're eventually going to get to a point where you realize that, hey, I actually don't want this to have to ask me for my username and password every single time. I just want this to run in the background. That's where you move to device-based authentication. I'm sure the guys have already spoken at length about that stuff, but we'll just quickly brush over it just so that I can show you the difference between the two things. Actually, what I'll do, I'm going to keep this one here. I'm going to open up another instance, jwt.io, and we'll do it like this. Okay, let's pop back over here. And I'll go down to my pre-baked one. So again, same deal. I'm using the same library, so MSAL.ps, but I'm just authenticating with the tenant ID, client ID, and a client secret. I've not shown the client secret because that's the correct thing to do. And we're just going to run this. And we can see that's already done. Device auth token. If I run that, we can see, again, same deal. Significantly less information this time, so I don't have anything around the ID. That's because there is no user. It's just implicitly allowed us to get access. Also note that scopes are now just default. There's nothing here. What we need is to sort of know where those permissions are and what they look like. So it's obviously going to be a little different. So if I grab those device tokens, and we'll chuck that into JWT, auth token, and we'll just chuck this in here. So it kind of looks the same. We've got some information around what the app registration is and all that sort of stuff. But what's important is that we still have permissions. So the API permissions are there. The difference here is that instead of being classified as scopes, they're classified as roles. So that is the key difference that you need to understand. I mean, there's a lot of key differences, but this is the one that I wanted to talk about today. So the difference between a user authentication is that you get scope permissions or delegate permissions, as opposed to a device authentication, you get roles or application permissions. So this is how you can have different permissions for delegate authentication as opposed to application permission. So maybe your delegate one doesn't have as much permission as your application one, but the idea is that you have only what you need and nothing more. So that's how you sort of get in and do that sort of fun stuff. I don't know whether you guys have dove too much into the actual auth token.
We have not dove nearly as deep as you have. We went very basic. Again, 101.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. So yeah, there's heaps of information in here, but most of the time you don't really need to know what this stuff is, but it is good for troubleshooting, especially if you're trying to do graph calls either interactively or with a system account or as device, and they are failing. Maybe you're getting 401 errors, which sort of implicitly says that you don't have the permissions that you need. always grab the token that's been generated. If you're doing it in PowerShell, you can almost always get access to that token. Grab it, chuck it into jwt.io, or if you're feeling a little paranoid and want to do it the Microsoft way, aka.ms/jwt is their implementation. It's less shiny. The important thing to point out here is that these tokens, as much as they are secure bits of information, they only live for a couple of minutes. And they never actually get stored on these things. It's because this is just a base 64 encoded bunch of key value pairs. So it doesn't need to be stored to actually analyze the thing, but functionally we can look at it in a couple of different ways. But troubleshooting with the token is really helpful, because then you can go, oh, I missed a specific role. And then you can go and add that in from your app registration, and then reauth, and sort of do that troubleshooting dance that we all know and love. Okay, so that's user and device. There will come a time where you've got a device-based PowerShell script that you've got successfully running on your local machine, aka prod, and a scheduled task or something on a machine, and you're like, maybe this makes more sense to not have it on my computer. And then you'd probably start thinking about ways that you can do that, maybe in the cloud. So the more advanced way, and the more, let's call it the more correct way to do authentication for graph things in Azure, in services that you build like Azure Functions, which we'll use today, is to use what is called a managed identity. So the important thing about a managed identity is that, like the name implies, it is managed. But the key benefit is that the security for that account is completely abstracted away from you. So you don't know what the password is. You don't know what the certificate is for authentication. You just know that there is an account and that I'm going to use it. The point of a managed identity is that for as long as you configure that identity against an application, it will be there. And when you delete that application, that permission or that identity disappears as well. What we'll do is I created an Azure function just to sort of show this off. If I can find it, I probably can't. I'm going to home, function app. Intune training demos is the one I created earlier. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this because I know you guys are going to do a bit of a deep dive into Azure Functions later on this year. But I just sort of wanted to show the context of managed identities. So I've gone ahead, I've created the function app in my environment. This works the same for things like Azure Automation as well. Pretty much anything that you create that isn't like kind of like an app service has the ability to create managed identities as well. So we go into here, we're going to scroll down to identity. And we can see I've already got this on, and it's already created the identity for me. And we can see what that principal ID. So that's the ID of my managed identity. We're doing system assign at the moment. You can do user assign, so you can essentially spoof your own account. So if you are doing something that only you're allowed to do, and you're not allowed to create system accounts, then you can absolutely do that. But most of the time, system accounts are fine. So if we go in here, we can see the identities created. I've got my function out that does nothing at the moment, but the final thing that you need to do to actually get this working is kind of a pain, because managed identities were primarily designed to allow you to work with resources in Azure that you have created. It wasn't really designed to work with Graph. There is a workaround for that. But if I go into my MSI or my managed identity, I should probably do this I'll do it correctly. So we're going to go into Azure Active Directory, Enterprise Applications. We're going to change this filter to Managed Identities and hit apply. So now we can see all of the different managed identities that have been created in our tenant. We can see there's been quite a few. We're going to go into Intune training demos. And just to confirm, if I go in here and grab that object ID, so FC188, FC188. So this is the matching one. We're going to go in. So this is my identity. This is just an account that exists. There are no, again, you can't reset the password for this. You can't do anything with it. You're not meant to really touch this. But if we go into the permissions, we can see that there's already a whole bunch of different graph things in here. This was done off camera. but it essentially allows me to sort of force in some permissions that I need to do the work that I want to do with this account. Note that there is no way to actually put this information in the screen. I have created a PowerShell script that we will provide a link to somewhere that you guys can use this to sort of have a play around. It's quite simple how it works. Essentially, the point is that you can do what we're supposed to do here. It's just that the UI hasn't caught up yet. But the idea is that I've simply authenticated. I'm swapping over my token for graph. I've got a whole bunch of different roles that I want to add to my my managed identity, and then I'm just going to chuck them in there. So again, I've written the code so that it makes it nice and easy for you guys to do this. We'll have the code available so you can have a play around. You can tell me that it doesn't work. But the idea is that once we have the roles that we need for the work, we can just import them in. So now when we run our function out, we're going to have access to that managed identity and those permissions. There is one other thing that I wanted to show off if we've got time.
We've got all the time in the world, Ben.
Sweet, because I feel like I've just been speaking for 20 minutes and you guys have just been sitting silently.
That was the plan all along.
Just terrified of interrupting you. It's just shocked.
Okay, all right, that's fine. So let's go over here. Okay, so we've got my function app, right? We've got a managed identity. Cool. How do we actually use it? It's not just magic, right? Like potentially it is, right? We've just created an identity and it's got no password, and we're just going to use what? Like how is this actually?
App just does it for me, doesn't it?
It does just do it for you. Yeah, exactly. Now the magic is actually just like 2 lines of code. If I go into the app files of the configuration of my function app, there's a whole bunch of settings, PowerShell scripts and things that exist. And again, the example that we're doing here is a PowerShell Azure function app. Same works for anything. If you're more comfortable in C#, you're probably not watching this video. But you know, like the same concept exists. We need a way to expose the fact that there is a managed identity in the environment, and then we need to be able to use that. So if I swap my files over to profile.ps1, profile.ps1 is a thing that runs every single time the Azure function app wakes up, and it essentially is a place where you can put in your secrets. If you've got any helper functions that you need to run that you don't want in your main code, you chuck them in here. This just sort of pre-sets up your environment. This is all off the shelf. I haven't changed any of this. This is just exactly what happens when you create a function app, a PowerShell function app. But lines 14 through to 17 is what does the magic source, or the secret source. So if we've got if environment MSI secret, then we're going to disable Azure context autosave. This is important because essentially when you authenticate with Connect AZ account, it leaves a little JSON file with your auth details encoded, but not very well. This line here, make sure that it's deleted. So it's a very secure way of essentially when the function app turns on for the first time, it's going to check to see whether there is a managed service identity. It's going to connect with that identity. Note that there are no passwords stored anywhere. We cannot expose what that is. Managed identities actually authenticate with a certificate. So there's no way that you can expose the client secret as an example and sort of start doing that thing. The idea is that the managed identity is as secure as it possibly can be. The next thing that you need to realize is that by design, managed identities do not work outside of Azure. You are not supposed to know how to use them externally. There are ways. They are all hacky. You do not want to set up Azure Arc or a connecting thing onto your local workstation so that you can get access to these things. You need to understand that these are for production only. But if you need to develop the function app that you are working on, then you'll probably want to authenticate locally to verify that the thing works. So to do that, we then go back to that previous device code that we were talking about with the ID and the client secret. And we just need a way to differentiate, hey, am I running this locally? If so, I'm going to use my device credentials. Otherwise, if I'm in production, then I'm just going to use my managed identity. And we get around that by using a very small bit of code that I wrote. I can go in here, but you know what? I'm just going to do it locally because it's cooler. So I'm in an instance of that Azure function running on my machine. If we go into my Intune training trigger run.ps1, these lines here, this is what we're looking at. I'll zoom in a little bit, but essentially what we're doing is the same thing that the profile.ps1 does. So we're looking for the existence of MSI secret in our environment. So if that doesn't exist, then we're going to assume that we are running this locally, because we cannot have a managed identity locally. So if we have the secret, all good. We've already got an identity token. So we're just going to swap that token out for a graph token. That's all this. That's all line 7 does. It just says, if we've already got a managed identity, cool. Can I please use that to get a token that lets me work with graph? We've already got the permissions that we aggressively forced into that identity. We just need to change the scope of the token to graph.microsoft.com. That allows us to implicitly do anything that we're allowed to do based on those permissions. So one line of code, we never need to think about auth again. There are no secrets to store. The lifecycle of the thing is not maintained by you. It just works. Locally, however, we don't have that. So what we need to do is the same sort of thing. So for security's sake, we're going to disable AZ context, the same thing that we were talking about before. And then we're just going to create the credentials to authenticate. So get me the client secret. We're going to connect to AZ account. We're going to use a token, and then we're going to create that auth header. It's the same thing that we've, that I'm hopefully you guys have seen before. But the benefit of this little code stub is that I can just use this in any one of my Azure functions that I create, and I never need to think about it again. As long as I've got my app ID, my secret, and my tenant in my settings, my app settings that are stored, then I'll be able to authenticate locally. Other than that, the function itself doesn't do anything. It's not very exciting, but this is how you sort of do local development with a managed identity. So the takeaway here, hopefully, if you guys have followed this far, it's 27-ish minutes in, is if you are developing things in Azure, do not use service accounts or client IDs and client secrets. Leverage managed identities where you can, because they are more secure. Because if you don't know what the password is, then there's less chance that you can accidentally expose what that password is. And I think that's the key benefit between service principals and managed identities. I think that's all I got. Did I do good?
You did fantastic, Ben. That's why we paid the big bucks.
I think so. I think so.
Awesome. Okay. Please unshare my screen. I think I'm done.
So we'll definitely cover some of the function app stuff. I don't think later in the year, but probably pretty soon, actually, to really kind of get going on that flow, and then doing some real world examples and things like that. But Sean, you were about to say something? Forgive me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so in full disclosure, if that that little code stub looks familiar to anybody, if you've looked at my any of the scripts that I wrote around automatically updating the primary user or dynamically updating it, it's because I literally stole that shamelessly from Ben. So
nice.
Dealing with pride. There's a book on that.
Yeah, there's nothing to be ashamed about. The point of these sort of things is that they're not necessarily tools, so they can't be bundled into like a function or anything. But once you've written it once, why not make it available for everyone else? It was greatly beneficial for me. I actually think I figured out how to do this stuff early last year. I think Jake was trying to work on something internally. He was like, oh man, if there was only a way that we could use that managed identity to just like not worry about passwords and authentication. So I spent a little bit of time to figure it out. Now we've got this, and now everyone can benefit from it. So the whole point of what I write is that I want to try and elevate everyone else so that we don't have to worry about these things and we can actually start focusing on better stuff. So as I said earlier, the code that I used for the to set those permissions in the managed identity, we'll make that available. It's in my GitHub. We'll put a link in the description or something like that. And then the user auth stub that we use for our function apps and things. I haven't got that stored anywhere. Actually, I do. It's in GitHub, but it's not in a. I'll put it somewhere, and we'll have a link for that as well. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the time, Ben. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You are more than welcome. Such a chatty crowd,
right? obviously, any questions, comments, concerns, leave them down below. We'll definitely message Ben to respond to any of them. So, but other than that, thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.